Hello, I'm Tommy Kirk, and I want to speak to you a little while on the topic of storms. Storms are situations in life that aren't good. The Bible speaks of those times symbolically as storms. When we read stories in the New Testament and Old where actual storms come, there are lessons that we can learn about these hard times in our lives that can help us make it through the storm. In Psalms chapter 46, verse 1, we get an encouraging message about our God. It says, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. We're able to see through this passage that when the storm comes, when the wind blows, when the earth moves, when the water rises, take refuge in the stronghold of God. If we run to Him in those hard times in our lives, we'll be okay. In the New Testament, we also get some wisdom about making it through a storm. And in Matthew chapter 7, as Jesus is concluding the Sermon on the Mount, He says this in verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. However, verse 26 says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. The rains come, the streams rise, and the winds blow and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So here we have the promise. Storms are coming. And if you haven't faced a storm in your life, the death of a loved one, a tragedy happening with your health, losing a job, something tragic happening in your life, if you haven't experienced that storm yet, well, guess what? There's one on the horizon. And if you don't know how to handle it, if you don't take that godly wisdom that comes from Jesus, if you don't run to God as your stronghold, you might find yourself in a tough situation. But something else we can take from this is that there are purposes. There is a purpose for the storm that comes in your life. And we're able to see this through the various storms and encounters Jesus and his disciples has with them in the New Testament. And so hopefully, after I'm done speaking, you'll be able to reflect on the storms that have occurred or are currently stirring in your life right now and grow from it because you're able to identify the purpose of that storm. First, one of the reasons that storms come, sometimes we're tested. Sometimes God uses a storm in our life to test us, to test our faith, and to see what we're made of, to see if we'll run to Him, to see if we'll rely on the wisdom of Christ. In Mark chapter 4, verse 38, we hear a story of the disciples and Jesus being in the midst of a storm. Verse 38 says, Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you even care if we drown?" He got up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" But before we really dig into the meat of that, I want you to listen to what the disciples said to Jesus. Don't you even care about us? Has there been a situation in your life, like I said before, or maybe a loved one died, someone that you leaned on for guidance is no longer here? Was there a moment where you looked up at the Lord and said, "Do you even care?" When that job that has provided financial stability for you and your family and being able to have the things that you want and need, and all of a sudden it's gone like that, and you look up and say, "Don't you even care?" See, these storms come through sometimes to test us, because Jesus, of course, God, of course, cares about us. But man, when those storms hit, sometimes it feels like we're in it by ourselves. I promise you, you're not. And in these times, perhaps we've grown a little bit too independent. Perhaps we've grown to a position where we don't feel like we need him. And sometimes these storms come through to remind us, I need to be running to God. I need to be relying on godly wisdom to make it through this, to strengthen the connection between you and him. So perhaps one of the reasons that the storms have occurred in your past or are occurring right now is because you're needing to be tested so that you can grow closer to God. Another reason that I believe storms occurred is for us to see God's power in action. I want you to think about this. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, we have another situation where Jesus is with his disciples in the midst of a storm. In verse 22, it says, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it." There's our storm. Verse 25. "Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said. And they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter said, 'tell me to come to you on the water.'" So in this situation, we have this storm that happened, and the disciples are only in the midst of this storm because Jesus told them to go there. Think about that for a moment. They did nothing wrong in life. They were doing exactly what Jesus told them to do, yet they end up in the midst of this storm. As I told you before, sometimes storms come our way, so Jesus is able to show his might, to show what he can do, to show his greatness. And in a moment, he does something that I've grown to just read past because I've heard the story so much. But symbolically, what Jesus did was he showed the disciples this thing that you're afraid of right now, this water that's throwing this boat around. I walk on it. I step on it. It's beneath my feet. I'm in that much control. I have that great a power that I can walk on the things that terrify you. And I don't know about you, but sometimes in the midst of my storms, I need to be reminded of how powerful Jesus is. I need to be reminded that that sick friend that I've been praying for, he has the power and the ability to make them well. Even when the doctors say there's no hope, even when the doctors say I don't know what else to do, I have to be reminded that I serve a God and I have a Savior in Jesus who is powerful. And he can do great things, and maybe that storm is there just to remind me of what he can do. But another thing that this storm does, is it allows us to see what we can do when Jesus is working in us. Because if you notice at the end of that passage, Peter says, well, Jesus, if it's you, allow me to come out to you. And again, I read past this so much because I've heard this story so frequently, but what's happening here is Peter is realizing he's able to do the things that Christ is doing. Think about that. Think about that. He's realizing that when he has Christ, when Christ is working in him and through him and for him, he is able to do things it would be impossible for him to do without Christ. And he finds himself walking on water. And we know how the rest of the story goes. He gets distracted. He begins to see the wind and the wave blow. And he forgets and he begins to doubt his ability to be like Christ in the midst of this storm. And that's why Jesus grabs him, pulls him up, and says, "O ye of little faith." Realize, Jesus is still standing on the water. Peter has not lost faith in Jesus. He lost faith in his ability to be like Jesus. And so these storms come around sometimes to allow us to see what we're able to accomplish, that we're able to do, that we're able to be like Christ, even when the world is spinning around us, to empower us, to encourage us to continue doing what we're doing, and to continue fighting the good fight. But there's another reason that storms come. Sometimes it's to discipline us. We're able to see that in a story back in the Old Testament about good old Jonah, right? We heard about this when we were young children and the great fish came and got him, but how did he end up in the belly of that fish? Well, God told him to do something, and he decided he was going to do something else. And because of that, a storm came, and it was affecting his life. And sometimes storms come our way when we choose to go a separate way than the way that God told us to go. And so sometimes when we have these situations happening in our lives, when we find ourselves in these situations, it's not because God doesn't care. It's not because, he has forgotten about us. It's because we decided to go our own route, and this is the consequence of that decision. But there's another reason that storms come, and this one's for free. This one's extra, right? Notice in that boat with Jonah were other people who had nothing to do with the poor decision Jonah made. However, they were in the storm with him. Y'all, sometimes we find ourselves in the midst of horrible situations, not because of anything we've done, but because of the company we keep. Sometimes we have to follow the same steps that these men took in this story of Jonah. And we have to take that person that's bringing these storms into our lives left and right, day in, day out, week after week, month after month. And we have to say, it's time for you to get out of my boat. So we have these storms that come our way. All of them are going to allow us to grow. All of them are going to hopefully sharpen us and make us better. But it's important that we realize that in the midst of the storm, if we're going to make it through, we have to remember that God is our refuge and our strength. And we have to realize that Jesus has given us wisdom to handle these situations. And if we do what he says, the way that he says them, the winds may blow, the sea may rise, the water might fall on our house, but it's going to stand tall because our house is firmly planted on the rock. As I said when we started this conversation, if you haven't had a storm happen in your life, get ready. There's one coming. when it does, you're going to seek the wisdom of God, you're going to run to him, and you're going to do as I suggested in this lesson. You're going to reflect and think, what was the purpose of this storm? And you're going to allow it to make you a better Christian and a better person as you live life day in, day out, week in, week out, as you strive to be the Christian God put you on this earth to be. I don't know where you are in your walk, but I'll be praying for you that when that storm comes, you'll be able to make it through. And you pray for me as well. Thank you.